Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening at Spa 25 virtually. This is Disinformation as Drama, Hollywood Double Agent. My name is George Blaustein. I teach American Studies here at the University of Amsterdam, and it is my pleasure to introduce and moderate this event. Our format is not too complicated. I'll give a little introduction and then I will hand it over to Jonathan Gill, who will tell us about this book. And then we will have two respondents, Ruud van Dijk and Nathalie Bank. And you'll see the Q&A. I'm under the I believe that you can see the Q&A box, and we very much welcome your questions. We have room for discussion and we'll answer as much as we can. And I look forward to a nice evening, albeit the surreal Zoom world evening that we have now perhaps gotten used to. Let me get right into it. I'm going to introduce our main speaker and get the ball rolling. I'll start with the CV. Jonathan Gill received his PhD in American literature and has taught literature, history, and writing at Columbia University, Barnard, the Manhattan School of Music, Fordham University, City College in New York, and the Hogeschool from Amsterdam, and is now at Amsterdam University College. He's also taught Yiddish at the University of Amsterdam. He's the author of Harlem, the 400-Year History from Dutch Village to Capital of Black America. That was from 2011. And he's written for many magazines and newspapers. He's also been a food columnist and a book critic for the Holland Times. But we are here to discuss his new book, Hollywood Double Agent, The True Tale of Boris Morros, film producer turned Cold War spy, which came out in May. Let me say something about this book before I hand the floor over. The life of Boris Morros is pretty wild, and I think we can call this book a potboiler. The term potboiler, I learned, was originally a kind of pejorative, but I certainly do not mean it that way. I would characterize the book as part John le Carré and part Woody Allen. Boris Morros might call to mind a figure like Zelig, a figure who pops up in different historical moments. Although Boris Morros is too distinctive to be a chameleon, he was a chubby movie mogul in a loud suit, always with a thick Russian accent. And this is the story of an opportunist, a fabulist, sometimes a hack, a figure caught between the KGB and the FBI, yet curiously without ideological conviction, or at least it's impossible to know for sure. This book is a history that often feels like fiction, only less plausible, which I also mean as a compliment, and I hope you take it that way. It follows the protagonist through various arenas, each one vivid, from Tsarist Russia, indeed from the innermost circles of Tsar Alexander and Rasputin, through Ellis Island and the mythologies of American immigration, through, interestingly, the world of American Zionism, through the forgotten world of early 20th century popular music, and through Hollywood and the Cold War, where the story is centered. It's a book that weaves two broad histories to powerful effect. One, the history of Soviet espionage, which is here alternately fumbling or sinister. And secondly, the history of the culture industry, the economic history of Hollywood, in fact. Boris Morros is ultimately something of a tragicomic figure, and placing him at the center of those histories makes those histories seem sad and farcical in equal measure. I enjoyed this book and I learned a lot from it. We can talk as well about how the book speaks to our own tragic and tawdry moment, since it is, after all, a story of Russian interference, among other things. Although I think that the interest and value of the book transcends that occasion. So with that introduction, I am happy to give the floor to our speaker. Jonathan, take it away.
Thank you, George. No one ever introduced me, included the words sad and farcical.
Not you, not you.
I understand. It's okay. Thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for being here, and also thanks for the people who are watching and listening wherever they are in the world. I know there are people in America also. I assume this afternoon for them. I'd like to give a little introduction to the relevance of this book to the current moment, and then introduce Boris a little bit. He's Boris to me, and then read a little bit of chapter 17 from the book, just about 10 minutes or so to give you an idea of how the book works. And then if we have time and there's the desire, I can share my screen and I can show you a piece of video that just surfaced just a few months ago. I was never even aware it existed, of a 3-minute interview that Boris gives in the late 1950s. Much of the discourse around American politics in recent years, especially at the presidential level, and especially at the level of presidential elections, concerns the uniqueness of our moment and our situation. Elections that are virtually sabotaged by the interference of undeclared enemies, a presidency whose focus on winning is so single-minded that it becomes vulnerable to short-term political and business interests, the lack of clarity and transparency about events in the White House, and that opens the door to conspiracy mongering and damaging speculation and distortion and outright falsehoods that end up getting inserted into the mainstream media cycle. But as a historian, I often tell my students that one of the worst mistakes that we can make is to engage in what I call temporal exceptionalism. That is the idea that the current moment is somehow unique. It's different than whatever came before, that it's new and that it's unprecedented. In fact, many of the features of the current political moment are anything but unique or new. I began this book during the Obama years. I finished it as the end of the Trump years was in sight. Hint, hint, it's not in sight anymore. And while the political and moral landscape certainly in America certainly changed in between those years, very little that we learned about the Trump presidency, especially when it comes to Russian interference in American politics, surprised those who knew the history of the relationship between Moscow and Washington going back almost a century. What we now know about Russian involvement in gaming the 2016 election, what we know about Putin's current efforts in that area, efforts that are more committed than ever, it should sadden and anger us, but it certainly shouldn't surprise us. And that's one of the many ways in which I think we owe it to ourselves to learn just a little bit tonight about one of the Kremlin's most important operatives during the early Cold War years, the film producer who became Moscow's man in Hollywood, the man that the FBI called our special agent. One of the challenges in the book was figuring out who this man was, who exactly was Boris Morros. His wife, who just died in May, I interviewed her several times. She was right there in the phone book. She said that she didn't really know who he was either, but he was good to her, and that's all that counted. He was good to me too, because he made for years and years of really wonderful research process. Even if I never quite figured out who this man was, it's not really true. I know who he was. He was a performer. He gave me what I wanted. He gives you what you wanted too. To the facts. Well, we don't really know many facts about Boris Morris from the beginning to the end. He was born sometime in 1890s in somewhere in Russia. He told the story at least 6 different ways. He was a child musical prodigy in St. Petersburg. Before he could even read. Remember, this was the time. I mean, if today parents want their kids to grow up to be doctors and lawyers, 100 years ago in St. Petersburg, people wanted the Jewish parents wanted their children to grow up to be violinists and pianists. It was the only way they could live in St. Petersburg legally, and it opened up all kinds of doors for the whole family. Eventually, Boris wangled his way into the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Maybe. I checked it out. He was never an official student, but he might have studied there informally. And eventually he became, after graduating, the musical director at the court of the last Tsar. Maybe, because he told us that, but elsewhere it's never, we could never confirm it. He chose the wrong side in the Russian Civil War and was turned into a refugee who worked his way to Constantinople. and eventually the United States, where he made his way up from silent movie organist in the Jewish ghetto of Roxbury in Boston. He crossed paths with Leonard Bernstein when Bernstein was just a child. They went to the same synagogue. Went from silent movie organist in the 1920s to the head of the music department at Paramount Pictures in the 1930s, and eventually he became an independent producer of movies, and along the way earned several Academy Award nominations. Eventually, he was recruited by Soviet intelligence, who basically wanted his Rolodex. They wanted him to use his contacts in Hollywood and in New York City, and increasingly in Washington, D.C., to reveal America's secrets, from the bomb to its vision of post-World War II Europe. He managed during this period to make espionage pay. He actually played the hunger of Soviet intelligence, the hunger for Hollywood gossip and stardom and riches, and managed to convince them to fund a number of his movie projects, and also eventually, when television came around, to fund some of his television projects as well. His television studios were located next to the Plaza Hotel, a floor away from where the Howdy Doody program was televised. How much more could you get in the 1950s? Eventually, he was identified by the FBI as a Soviet operative, and depending on how you want to understand it, they either forced him to become a double agent, or, as he tells it, he, out of pure patriotism, decided to violate the agreements that he had with his Soviet operatives. As a double agent working for the FBI, his main job was feeding disinformation to the Kremlin. Everything from false reports about American aviation technology, what rubber was used in the tires of the landing gear on jet fighters, that kind of thing. But he also supplied them with gossip about the sex lives and drinking habits and gambling problems of some of America's most prominent public figures. It all came to a climax in 1949, when Boris found himself inside the temple. The temple is the word that Soviet intelligence used for the White House. He found himself in 1949 dining privately with President Roosevelt. What a coup for American intelligence. That the Soviets thought they had an agent who's finally inside the temple. And that's where this chapter starts, with his going to the White House. 1948 was a very good year for American intelligence, mostly because it was a really bad year for Soviet espionage, at least their operations in the United States. After the 1948 revelations of Elizabeth Bentley, a once famous blonde spy queen, actually she was a brunette, she gave the names of 80 Soviet operatives to the FBI, operatives operating at the White House, and the Department of Justice, and Department of War, and Department of Energy. That was one event of late 1948 that was really crushing to Soviets. And then Whittaker Chambers, also a once famous American character, an ex-communist writer who identified Alger Hiss, who was one of the founders of the United Nations Charter Conference, as a communist spy. He had denounced him before the House Un-American Activities Committee. These two characters, Elizabeth Bentley and Whittaker Chambers, with their coming out into the open, there was a sense in Moscow that their American operations has weathered the worst, perhaps. But then on December 15th, 1948, Alger Hiss was actually indicted for perjury. 5 days later, Lawrence Duggan, a State Department official whom the FBI had been interrogating on suspicion of being a Soviet agent, committed suicide. And the following week, the FBI identified Judith Kaplan, a 28-year-old analyst at the Justice Department's Foreign Agents Registration Section, as a spy. The fact wasn't made public, and Kaplan wasn't arrested, but Moscow found out soon enough. Moscow ordered a full stop to its American operations because they were sure that they would come under increased scrutiny in the months to come. But Boris Morros didn't fold just because the stakes had been raised. In early 1949, eager to find some way to change Moscow's mind about funding his new television production company, Boris played a card that neither side knew he was holding. Back in the summer of 1947, just weeks after Boris was turned by the FBI, Boris heard that President Truman's daughter, Margaret, who fancied herself an opera singer, would be debuting at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. Boris had heard the gossip, and he knew Margaret wasn't much of a singer. But something told him she would be worth getting to know. This was the president's daughter. The concert was a musical disappointment, but it led to one of the most significant moments of Boris's career as a spy. He invited himself to a party held for the singer several weeks later in the palm room of the Beverly Hills Hotel, and he worked his way into her confidence. Boris convinced her that she ought to be in the movies. Can you believe anyone would believe that line? She ought to be in the movies, and he promised her a starring role in his next picture. They stayed in touch, and when Margaret invited Boris and Catherine to have dinner with the folks in February of 1949, Boris didn't have to think twice about answering positively. Her folks were, of course, the President and First Lady of the United States of America. Compared to what it is today, security at the White House in the 1940s was minimal, so there was no complicated procedure to get inside, not even if you were a spy. Margaret simply left Boris and Catherine's names with the ushers at the north portico entrance, which led up to the state floor. Margaret and her mother were waiting there. They took Boris through the grand entrance hall, down the cross hall, but instead of having dinner in the stateroom where dignitaries dined, they settled into the family dining room, which was considerably more intimate. Even better, Boris thought. But then he realized that they were starting dinner without the president. Would he show up at all? He comforted himself with the swanky surroundings, the food and the china and the heavy silverware. And they ate, and he'd almost given up hope of seeing the president when Truman walked through the door. Truman, who was a head taller than Boris and half his weight, bent over to shake hands, and they became friends for a few minutes. Even for someone who had consorted with the Tsar and the Pope, with movie stars and millionaires, the music business and the future of television, there wasn't really anything worth reporting back to Moscow in their conversation, but Boris still felt justified in pursuing it, thinking it might lead to something he could take back to Moscow, of course, with the FBI's position, because he was a double agent by this point. All too soon, though, the president stood up and apologized, saying he had to get back to work. And then the first lady did the same. And Boris and Catherine were left alone with Margaret, who had absolutely nothing to give him, or so he thought. He made the most of it, according to a secret report later filed with the KGB. Truman was politically to the left of his FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover. Who wasn't to the left of J. Edgar Hoover? But his daughter was a genuine progressive. Margaret hated Wall Street, the House Un-American Activities Committee, racists. She wasn't afraid to go public about any of this. Encouraged by Boris, Margaret divulged some very interesting information about tensions within Truman's cabinet and his closest advisors over the direction the country was headed diplomatically. Margaret confided to Boris that the president had recently been involved in a very heated discussion on foreign affairs with his vice president, Alvin Barkley, with his veteran diplomat and soon-to-be Soviet ambassador Charles Bolin, with Secretary of State Dean Acheson, with the financier and advisor Bernard Baruch, and with General Dwight Eisenhower, who was then president of Columbia University, but would soon himself become president. Baruch and Eisenhower, neither of whom was considered an accommodationist when it came to communism, nonetheless insisted that Truman, quote, this is Boris's quote, shake off the influence of reactionary generals and Wall Street businessmen and staff his cabinet with people who wanted to engage the Soviet Union in honest commercial language. Eisenhower became so passionate that he pounded the table with his fist while insulting hardliners like the former Undersecretary of State Robert Lovett and the Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. Eisenhower went so far as to call Boris's friend Lucius Clay, a general who was in charge of the post-war Berlin, a protege of German fascists. At a time when the official message coming from Washington was that Americans needed to stick together in order to counter socialist expansion across the globe, especially now that China had fallen to the communists, Boris had stumbled on an intelligence coup, a schism in the president's cabinet. But that wasn't all. Margaret also unwittingly leaked details of the group's discussion about the individuals that Truman was considering appointing as ambassadors to Britain and France. The Soviet Union would have wanted to know this. Boris was so excited he could barely muster up the facial expression appropriate to Margaret's lament that never in American history has a president had to battle such enemies. Sound familiar? But he did manage to promise Margaret before leaving that he would do his very best to cast her in his next film, or perhaps she might play a role in one of the television programs he was developing. As Boris walked Catherine out into the mild winter evening and looked out over the South Lawn, across the ellipse to the Washington Monument, he felt a combination of pride and disappointment. Boris had spent his life trying to get close to great men, but he'd never become one himself. Not yet. So that's really all I wanted to do for right now with the book. And I don't know, George, if we have enough time to play the video of Boris's interview. Do you think we have enough time?
I would think so. If it's a couple minutes, I think we'd all be curious to see
Okay.
the figure we are learning about.
Yeah, I mean, you'll see immediately he's not, he's no James Bond. He's more Maxwell Smart, I think, than James Bond. I'm going to share my screen, and then we're going to play this share. Good. And can everyone see my screen now?
I can.
Good. Okay, so we'll now play this video, which is in the collections of Southern Methodist University, and it became public just a few months ago after I'd finished writing the book. There are very few instances of Boris being recorded or caught on video. Really, the only video that exists is in the hands of the FBI, and it's not available. So here's Boris being interviewed in the late 1950s or early 1960s, after he'd come out from the cold. Maybe we need to. And this is Boris on the right in the hat. And I really hope we can have some audio. Maybe not. If we can't have the audio, I'll try to work on it, but then we should just go on to the next video.
I think the audio is trouble for me.
All right. Okay. George, back to you.
Sorry to say that the audio was difficult, but we will post the link in the Q&A. And thank you, Jonathan. Now I am going to introduce. We'll get a couple of responses, and I'll introduce our responses, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. I'll first introduce Ruud van Dijk, who teaches the history of recent international relations, German history, and he has a foot in American studies here at the University of Amsterdam. His current research is on the Dutch role in NATO's 1979 dual track decision on theater nuclear forces, and more generally, what could be called the anti-nuclear revolution of that era. And he has co-published the Encyclopedia of the Cold War, an invaluable resource, and is currently working on the digital version. And he is a lovely colleague, and it is nice to share a Zoom panel with him. Ruud, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Jonathan, for the book. Thank you, the organizers of this seminar, for the invitation. Let me say that this is a great story about an equally great storyteller. I've read it with more than a little interest and pleasure. As a historian, professional historian, reading this, you get very curious about the provenance of all the detail that we get here, because there's a lot of it, and much of it quite specific. But Jonathan, as he also just did in his presentation, throughout is pretty candid about certainly the unreliability of Boris's own accounts of his exploits. And at the end of the text, we get a equally transparent discussion of all of the materials from which his account was construed, much of it, fortunately, more trustworthy than what Morris himself has wanted us to believe about his, and this is certainly true, uncommon life. In a larger sense, I think the story certainly rings true. The historian's imaginative skill, which is always required in the writing of history, has been indispensable for it. And Jonathan, the author, his ability here is on full display. To point this out, the imaginative skill of the historian author shouldn't detract from how great his prowess as a detective also is. How impressively he has assembled countless pieces of rich and a complicated life puzzle extending over more than 7 decades. So it's both the detective work, the research, and the imaginative skill with which he's written the story that's made it a truly pleasure to read. So nothing but praise as far as I'm concerned here. About the story itself, it's one that first and foremost is uniquely tied to the time period in which it unfolds. Jewish life in late imperial and revolutionary Russia, immigrant life in interwar America, Hollywood's golden age, and ultimately, and most centrally, mid-century Soviet espionage in the United States. Now, at first, one may be inclined to think that a life story of a character such as Boris Morris, one tied so closely to a particular era, has little to tell us today. But the theme of global influence in Hollywood, the theme of global interest of the global influence of Hollywood and the interest of foreign powers to influence its output, that's of all time. That's also of our time. And certainly espionage is too, in all its forms. And so we can try to think, as we should with all history, about the so what question. Other than a very good read and an insight into a very colorful and consequential life in a turbulent historical era, what can we take away from this book? Now, broadening things a little bit in regard to the former, global influence in Hollywood, an account such as this one can make us pay more attention than we do right now, frankly, to ways in which soft power and anti-soft power works in the world. In Boris's time, Moscow sought to influence or limit Americans' exposure, for example, to what Leo Trotsky might have to tell them. They used their connection to Boris to deny Trotsky public venues at which to speak. Recent years, we've probably all come across examples of how the Communist Party of China not only prevents its people from seeing certain Hollywood productions, but also seeks to suppress the kind of speech in the West that is, for example, sympathetic to its opponents in Hong Kong. Chinese nationals living overseas or people of Chinese descent often play important parts in these efforts. Of course, between parentheses, but important nonetheless. US and other Western governments implicitly or explicitly have worked and continue to work to affect public opinion in authoritarian states, directly or indirectly, through a variety of cultural products. The two are not the same, but we have to be careful not to suggest that this is one-way traffic. In regard to the second broad theme, espionage, the central theme really of the book, there are many things that come to mind. There is, of course, the stealing of information, scientific, technical, political. Here, the differences today may be more significant than the similarities, because with the cyber domain added to the playing field, there's probably very few spies walking around with stolen documents in briefcases, the way Boris and some of his colleagues were doing way back when. Then there's this, from the title of the session, disinformation business. How one uses both willing collaborators and so-called useful idiots to carry out so-called active measures against one's opponent. We know there's plenty of that going on today. But again, technology, especially social media, makes at least the way in which it's carried out rather different than 80 some years ago. And because of social media's reach, disinformation campaigns can be a lot more extensive and, from the viewpoint of the initiator, effective. Now, in closing, another question we could ponder as we think about relations between Western societies and autocratic adversaries such as Russia and China or Iran, whether it's as unevenly divided as during the time in which Boris Morris was active. Jonathan points this out a couple of times. Whether open societies such as ours are still at a fundamental disadvantage vis-a-vis more closed ones, or whether again technology and a more globalized world than in the 30s, 40s, and 50s has leveled the playing field here. Now, my guess is that an open society continues to be more vulnerable to various kinds of outside influence and espionage, and that their resilience lies with the general public's awareness of how authoritarians may want to sow confusion and discord, and the public's determination not to be fooled, not only by valuing truth over theory, especially conspiracy theory, but also living by and defending the core principles upon which an open society has to be built. I think closed societies are vulnerable, just like during the Cold War, precisely because they are closed, because their leaders do not trust their people to make up their own minds. Their resilience lies in their leaders' ability to suppress the aspirations of their people, while their great vulnerability is the desire of many people to make up their own minds and hold their leaders accountable. So, in this sense, I think we're still in a kind of Cold War. And the question, in light of this comparison, is whether in our globalized world, one side or the other has become more vulnerable to the information and disinformation from the other side. And I suppose that next month, the American voter will give us an indication. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruud, for that very thoughtful comment and even worrying comment, but eloquent in its worry. I can now introduce our second respondent. Nathalie Bank is a researcher and PhD candidate at the Ministry of Defense, of the Netherlands, the Research Institute TNO, and Utrecht University. She is currently writing her dissertation about overt cyber influence operations in irregular warfare, case study Islamic State. She has an academic background in American studies, I am proud to say, and as well as media studies at the University of Amsterdam. Nathalie, I can give the floor to you.
Thank you for that introduction, George. And thank you to Jonathan Gill, and thank you to the organization. I'm really glad and thankful to be here today to talk about and shed a little extra light on the book that Jonathan Gill has written. It's really very enlightening. It's really interesting to see the life of a double agent from start to finish as he has shaped this life. It becomes mythical, and the biggest contributor to those myths is Boris Morros himself, I think. And also thank you, Ruud van Dijk. I think I'll be building on some of the thoughts you just shared with us in my little, in my response. So I think when you read the book, Hollywood Double Agent, you'll soon find that Boris Morros, in the manner in which Jonathan Gill has depicted him, is a man with a very complex life. Perhaps he's even a complex man, but he's also somehow very shallow. From the very first chapter through the last, it's very clear that he doesn't have an overt ideology that he follows. And it also is very clear why, because early in his life, he realizes that fully committing to an ideology, whether that be a religious ideology or maybe a political conviction, can be deadly. It can be deadly. And he realized that as people around him in Russia died as he grew up, and as he nearly escaped death by escaping Russia as a young adult. I think he took that lesson throughout his life, that overtly committing to an ideology can be very dangerous. But he also had this inherent drive to be an important person, to be in the room where it happens. And I think he used his musical talents and his charm, and particularly that drive that determination to be an important person, to always get ahead. He was very resilient. His life was nothing if not uneventful. I think he did what had to be done in his own creation of what he wanted his life to be, for him to get ahead. And a part of creating that life was lying. He lied as he entered America. He lied as he talked to people about his career, about his position, about his origin. And as you read the book, you come to realize what an incredible work it must have been for Jonathan Gill to uncover so much about Boris Morris's life, because throughout the life of that guy, he worked very hard to make sure you couldn't really pinpoint him, I guess. In all the things that Jonathan uncovered, I think it becomes very clear that there are several overarching themes that are still very relevant in today's society, many of which Ruud already touched upon, and I will build upon a little bit, some of which I'll build on. But there's just a lot of commonalities in the fact that there's global unrest. Well, when is that not the case? You'd almost think there's a big pattern of immigration. And of course, there is the idea of influence activities being constantly exerted upon countries in both directions. Like Van Dijk said, it's important to not think this is a one-way street. And the themes I want to talk to you about today that link quite directly to those influence activities. I want to talk to you about the obfuscation of truth, and I want to talk to you about the interference of presidential elections. So that's kind of an overarching theme, and then a more precise subject to sort of illustrate how that works. At the end of the book, Jonathan Gill mentions the movie that was made about Morris's life after he was uncovered, after it was clear that he was a double agent, and the knowledge about his life, or at least about his role as a double agent, sort of became common knowledge. There was this movie, and the byline of the movie was stranger than fiction. And I think that's very apt, and that's the main feeling I got as I was reading this book, is the idea that, oh, wait a minute, I am reading a historical work. I'm not reading a book of fiction. Sometimes it was really hard to keep yourself in that realization, because in this case, fact really is stranger than fiction. And I think that theme is very apt today, because we live in a world in which the line between fact and fiction, between truth and lies, is constantly blurred. That brings me to the idea of the obfuscation of truth. Well, what is the obfuscation of truth? Let's begin with that. There's a lot of other words that convey a similar idea. You'll probably be familiar with the word lies, or disinformation. But a very popular one right now is the alternative truth. The idea is that there's very many different narratives out there about a certain event or a person or anything, really, just a lot of narratives about one subject. And if there's that many narratives, then you can't really tell what the truth is anymore. And this is a thing Morris used in his life. This is a tool he used. He realized that if he tells enough lies about his past, there's going to be so many narratives about him in existence. Who's going to tell what the truth is? And if you can't tell what the truth is, how are you going to catch someone in a lie? I think the pattern of him using that skill and that tool throughout his life is super applicable to today. And in order to sort of further examine how harmful that can be, I want to talk to you about the elephant allegory, or the elephant metaphor. You might already know it. Imagine 10 people in a room standing around an elephant. Every person is in a different position, and you are asking all of them to tell you what an elephant is. So one person might say, well, I see a tail and a butt and 2 legs. And another one might say, well, I see a head and a big trunk, and I actually see 3 legs because I'm sort of standing askew. Anyway, if 10 people are going to tell you, if those 10 people are going to tell you what an elephant looks like, they're all going to give you a different story. They're all going to give you a different narrative about what an elephant is, because none of them is seeing the entire elephant. And even if you're putting all the 10 narratives together, you're still going to have a very confusing mess, because there's still going to be the disagreeing between whether an elephant has 2 legs or 4. Now imagine those same 10 people trying to describe that elephant, but one of them is being paid to do so by the anti-elephant lobby. And this person thinks, you know what I'm going to say? This elephant's really aggressive and it's really violent and dangerous. And another person is being paid by the peanut industry, and they're saying, you know what's interesting? These elephants would be great pets for rich people, and they love peanuts. Obviously, this is like a really basic example, but this is what's happening in media nowadays. There are so many narratives about any single thing going on. You can find 10 different perspectives. I mean, that's an understatement, about any single event. And as a result, even though the truth is going to be out there, and there's going to be that person describing an actual elephant, and hopefully there's going to be more than one person with integrity trying to actually objectively describe events as they occur, it's going to be really hard to pick that one out, because it's really difficult to tell which is the right one. And I think a really good example of how that can build up and get out of hand is what we saw last week with President Trump getting diagnosed with COVID. He's been treated and he's been released from the hospital a few days later. This is what we've been told. Obviously, there's a lot of commentary about this. There's a lot of coverage about it. And one of the most often asked questions is, did he even really get COVID? did he really get it? And I'm not going to say whether he got it or not. I'm not here to make any claims. But the fact that this question gets asked, that people doubt whether or not the president is really sick or whether he's using it as part of his campaign somehow for his, in his run to be president again. The fact that these questions are being asked, that's showing that there's real damage done to the integrity of an elected government, and therefore the integrity of a democracy, of a nation. So this idea of the obfuscation of truth as it further expands in current society, it can be a real danger to society, especially democratic society. And I think this nicely ties into what Ruud van Dijk was saying about closed and open societies, closed and open countries, and where the vulnerabilities lie. That being said, keep in mind the obfuscation of truth, keep in mind the danger this can pose to a stable democracy. I want to move to the next theme, which is the influencing of elections, which happens in Morris's book. In Morris's time, in 1948, there's an election, a presidential run between Wallace and Truman. And Wallace is a progressive, and there's this couple, the Stearns. I think he's like an ambassador. And I'm sorry, Jonathan, I forgot the fact of his position. I think he was an ambassador and she was his wife. And Morros knows that this couple, she's convinced him to support Moscow, and Morros knows that this couple has flipped to be Soviet supporters. And by this time, Morros is also informing the FBI. So he lets the FBI know, hey, this couple, the Stearns, keep an eye on them. They're not kosher. He probably didn't use those words. And as the Stearns were getting closer and closer to Wallace, the FBI knew what was going on. So they were on guard. The KGB realized that the Stearns their cover was blown, and therefore the entire attempt of colluding with Wallace to influence the election was sort of dropped. So this is actually an instance in which intelligence for the US, in this case through Boris Morros, managed to stop collusion and interference from a foreign state in an American presidential election. Now, obviously, you know where I'm going to go with this. I'm going to go fast forward a little bit to 2016, because 1948 was not the last time Russia tried to interfere with American politics and presidential elections. So, of course, there's still, I agree with Ruud van Dijk that not in the same measure as there used to be traditional espionage, as you might see in like the classic movies and read in this book. But of course, it still happens. There's still backroom politics. There's still secret conversations. There's still going to be a lot of wiretapping going around. But the real influential stuff happens right in the open nowadays. And it ties into the obfuscation of truth symptom that I was talking about earlier. This can be engaged with on purpose. This can be a goal of people to obfuscate the truth, obviously, to use as a tool in their favor. And in 2016, in the election, Trump has been accused of colluding with Russia to influence audiences to win the election. Now, no matter who, it doesn't even matter who instigated it, but what happened was certain very specific populations in the United States, in swing states, which are the states that hold that don't traditionally vote red or blue, and that hold a significant amount of electoral votes. And within those swing states, there's particular counties that are specifically important in winning those electoral votes. So Trump's campaign, along with Cambridge Analytica, very specifically targeted audiences, swing or undecided voters in those areas with fake news articles, trying to influence them to vote for Trump or abstain from voting altogether. These fake messages were articles like Obama admits he was born in Kenya after all, was one of the articles that did really well. Another article that did very well because it hit it right in the Bible Belt was the Pope endorsing Trump. And then Hillary was obviously vilified a lot as well. These messages were very effective. The bigger research has found that the bigger the untruth, like the bigger the falsehood in a message, the more often it was shared by audiences. And it worked because Russia, which has been proven to be at least one of the centers of these influential activities, of these fake news messages, Trump won. Hillary had 3 million more votes in the popular vote, but Trump had more electoral votes, and so he won. And that's just a very clear example of how these influence activities and these disinformation activities have moved into the 21st century. So the activities really aren't very different in essence, in that they're still about influencing elections, they're still about disinformation, and they're still about targeting the right audiences, but the tools to do these activities have become much more accessible. And I think a storyteller like Morros, were he to live today, he would be frightfully adept at using them. And we should probably, as we read the book, we should take into consideration how he would function in today's society and what that means about today's society. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. I think all of the panelists should turn their videos on for the discussion portion of this evening. Don't you think? Ruud, Natalie, Jonathan? Ruud, I hope you'll unmute yourself and reveal yourself to us once again.
I hope I didn't put him to sleep.
He's still there. He's still there. We have 2 thoughtful responses. One from Natalie about Morros as a kind of prophet of our own era's confusion, even if our own era's confusion is mediated differently. And Ruud van Dijk with a reflection on the vulnerabilities of open and closed societies. Jonathan, well, first I encourage the people watching to submit, the people on Zoom to submit their questions, and we'll get to them. While you're framing those questions, I invite Jonathan to respond if anything strikes.
Sure.
To respond to.
I mean, I can go on all night, so you got to stop me at some point if we get a question. I mean, I think that one thing that gets addressed here is, like, what do we mean? Like, when Natalie talks about this metaphor with the elephant, there's actually an elephant there in the room, right?
Right.
So what we're going to do with that's going to find out what the story is. And one problem that I had throughout the writing of this book was, like, where do I finally touch bottom? Like, what do I really know? What can I really know? And one might think, okay, well, I interviewed Boris's wife, right? Well, she also lied to me, right? About Boris, about lots of other things as well. She was very entertaining, but how about newspaper interviews? Obviously not. And one of the great things about the internet is that I don't have to spend 10 years in dusty archives. I can find literally 15,000 articles that were written by Boris Morris in a huge variety of sorts of documents. But so those interviews and articles in trade publications, radio annuals from the 1920s and 30s, they're also not fully trustworthy. I mean, I can triangulate in some cases. One might think, okay, what about documents, right? You can go in 4 clicks on your mouse, you can, people don't have a mouse anymore, sorry. In 4 clicks on your computer, keystrokes, you can get Boris Morris's entry papers from December 14th, 1922 at Ellis Island. Well, as we all remember from that scene in The Godfather where they give Vito, what's his name, Andolini, a different name, they call him Vito Corleone. They just wrote down what you told them, and he lied on his Ellis Island application about his weight, his height, his hair color. He didn't have any hair. He said he wasn't married to Catherine when they arrived. Boris lied on his draft card for World War II. He lied on census reports. He lied on his citizenship application. And I don't think he really considered to be lying. I think he considered to be storytelling. Maybe we can think, do we finally touch bottom when we can look at the declassified documents that were released by both the FBI, available through the Woodrow Wilson Center at Princeton University, and on the other hand, at the variety of declassified and translated, decoded documents that were produced by the Soviet espionage and intelligence services. But of course, even cases where they treat the same items, we're not sure if we have everything. There are plenty of gaps. In many cases, the documentation on the Soviet side was selectively collected, so we don't have everything. In many cases, they're pseudonyms for spies. We still haven't figured out who they are. And by the way, if you're interested, Boris's pseudonym as a spy for the NKVD was Frost. Well, for those of you who speak Russian, you may know that Morros in Russian means frost. What kind of intelligence service gives a man a pseudonym that's actually just the translation of his name from Russian into English? And it makes me, I mean, I have to say that both the Soviet and the American intelligence apparatuses were kind of like a desperate joke during this period. I don't know, maybe they still are, in part because on the American side, the FBI was run by a madman, J. Edgar Hoover. The Soviet intelligence services were also run by madmen, but they just kept switching every couple of years. So finding a place to touch bottom really just becomes a question of comparing, what he said on his arrival papers with what I know from the census report, with which I saw in an average. So that's the way, so using as many sources as possible. That's how I tried to kind of figure it out. Of course, we also have his autobiography, which—
Jonathan, let me take my moderator's prerogative and
please do,
and jump in here a little bit. Although I am genuinely fascinated in the process of excavating this story. We do have a question from the participants. One asking, what is the moral lesson that we should get out of this? And noting that the lessons that we seem to be finding in the book are in fact quite complex. It doesn't seem to me that the book offers any kind of moral lesson in individual terms of an individual actor doing right or doing wrong. This seems like a world in which there are very few. It seems like a world in which there are very few heroes. The relation of the narrator to the subject in the story is something of an ironic one. I'm not necessarily convinced that the value of the book is not as a cautionary tale. The value of the book to me is not as a cautionary tale about Russian interference in the election necessarily, but it does actually, there is some kind of lesson, and I think Ruud's comment was about this. There's some kind of lesson about the vulnerability of a public. So there might be a civic lesson at issue in this book rather than a moral lesson. I wonder if you would reflect on that.
And I'm not so sure. I mean, we're dealing with politicians here, right? And I really tend to go towards a different route when looking for whatever moral lessons there are. Some of you may recall E.M. Forster, the novelist, said, "If I were ever forced to choose between my country and my friends, I hope I would have the moral courage to choose my friends." So in a certain sense, you think governments change, political parties change, Boris rides them all out. One thing you might look to is, how did he treat his friends? Mm-hmm. And I think what we see here is that he treated them very badly. He pretended they were friends. I don't think he really had any friends. He had a terrible marriage. His second marriage, I don't know. It's impossible for me to find out. He wrote nothing about it. And Marion, who's not around anymore, had her own particular interests. But I think that in the end, the only thing you can really trust, and this also goes to our current White House, is greed. Because at least you know that Morris, as the Soviets said in one of their declassified cables, Boris loves money. So he was always going to do what was ever right for his pocketbook. You can't trust him on politics. You can't trust him on the personal, but you can always trust him on money. And that doesn't seem a very high bar, a very high standard to draw. But it really does. It really, for me, it was really the one thing that was sort of my North Star when I tried to figure out what was he trying to do at this moment, beyond just survive. He was trying to make money. And in that sense, he really exposes the Soviet operatives as better capitalists than the Americans in a certain sense, and with their interests in playing, investing in his his companies in order to get a political payback. So, I mean, I don't know. I think that morality has nothing to do with this story. I mean, one would think that morality has everything to do with every story, but it really doesn't have that much to do with the story. It was such a political universe, and so many of the motives of the major characters were so fully overdetermined or oversaturated. There's no patriot in this book. You know, there's no upstanding moral character. There's nothing like that here. I mean, I hope that's not like the way it is in the world out there, but that I wasn't seeing that here. Even, you know, the way Boris's family relations, his own relationship with his son. I also tracked down his descendants, and something really strange happened. I talked to a cousin, I talked to a second cousin, I talked to a great grandchild. I would get this great response at the beginning. I would say, I know more about this guy than anybody on the planet. You can have all my files. Would you like to talk? And they'd say, yes, yes, yes. And then there would be radio silence in the next. And I think there's a sense in which people are really deeply uncomfortable with the kind of life that he led. I mean, it wasn't a typical life in terms of, you know, all the drama, but it might have been a very typical life of its time, in the sense that the bottom had kind of dropped out during the Cold War. Like, who are we going to really trust here? Who's my good guy? Who's my bad guy?
You know, this rendering of the world. This is a kind of question I have about the book, whether I want to see the book as a very high stakes story about the fate of our democracy, or a reassuringly low stakes story about the fate of our democracy, whether or not our democracy actually exists, and whether we, whatever we mean by that, as a parable of the culture industry, as a portrait of Hollywood. It actually reminded me, it called to mind, for example, the Coen brothers movie Hail Caesar, which I don't, you know, we don't have to talk about this, but this is also about it's about Hollywood in the immediate post-war period. It's about communist espionage, and there is, in fact, there is a deep seriousness. There is a deep seriousness in that movie about. There's some kind of fundamental worry about the cheapness of culture, and here's Boris moving between a world of what would seem like ideological seriousness, but is actually a kind of fumbling cynicism world, and then a fumbling cynicism espionage world, and then a world that he does seem to care about. He does weirdly seem to care about music. He wants a certain kind of I don't know. He takes culture seriously. Should we read a book like this and worry more about our culture industry, or should we read a book like this and worry more about our politics?
I don't worry about either one. it's endless, okay? But I do what you do suggest is, I think, really important, which is that if you're looking for moral guidance in the story or in our public lives, one place for sure you could look is in the movies. Maybe that's where you get the pure characters. Maybe that's where you get the real patriots, right? Maybe that's where you get the real bad guys too. Because one really interesting part of the whole story was the humanization of the villains. You know, they also had families and they also had children. And I also had a really bizarre experience. The number 2 starring role in the book is a Soviet spy, a famous Soviet spy named Jack Sobel. And I learned a couple of years ago that when Jack Sobel was dying in Bellevue Hospital, my uncle was his attending physician. I learned this, and his wife said, he's been telling me the story for years. I never believed it, but apparently it's true. So, so the humanization. I mean, you know, the bad guys also end up, you know, in many cases, dying in bed, disappointed, and it's very disturbing to see how Boris treats all of them, and maybe how he treated himself too, because in the end, he was alone. I mean, his first wife divorced him. His father was gone. His son he wasn't talking to. He had a second wife, but that was also a troubled marriage in many ways. And so in the end, it was just him and his negative bank account, because he was never a rich man.
I want to ask if there are, I don't know if Ruud or Natalie, if you guys want to chime in. I believe, actually, we've run 5 minutes past the time we have been allotted by Afspraak 25. So I should bring this to a close before too long. But first, I want to know if there are, we have a response on the question. Ruud, I give
Let me
this
just
to you.
real quick say that, you know, I sort of tailored my comments because in accordance with what the organizers asked me to do, and I'm inclined to do that anyway. But I do think that rather than looking for moral lessons, I think this still, I mean, it's another quality of the book that is all good history. It helps you ask better questions about the present, and you read the book at all these levels, and you think, okay, this is very much tied to the time period, but these larger themes, you can see them at work. And then the point is not to say, well, see, that's the same today. It's you can analyze your own situation, say, well, this is different, this is but the similarities are there too. So it's another way in which this is just very useful, in addition to just a lot of fun.
It's also interesting to compare the amount of information that was coming out of the White House in the 1940s and 1950s with the amount of information that is supposed to be coming out of the White House now. And instead what we have is this saturation of conflicting voices that are representing what's going on in the White House. Whereas in Truman's time, you didn't have a daily press briefing. You didn't have a massive publicity apparatus generating all these documents every day from the White House. So it's a strangely ironic situation now that for all of our open society, we don't really have a good idea what's going on inside there, just like it used to be. But I think in the old days, in the 1940s, there was a certain level of sort of gentlemanly sense of discretion, shall we say, about what's happening with the president's personal life. Natalie, did you want to have a word here about any of this or anything else?
I'm just listening to all the brilliant additions you guys, all the brilliant reflections I'm hearing here. I'm just in agreement with the big contrast you are just describing between the amount of messages coming out of the White House then and now. And just because this is my discipline, this is where I'm going with my head, I think that's sort of symptomatic for today's culture. I just can't help but be really curious how George would live in today's world. Who would he be in today's world? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, George, you mentioned Zelig from the Woody Allen film, and then of course that was always occurring to me. I mean, also, I mean, I think Natalie, maybe Ruud, you mentioned that that the existence of the internet has really changed spycraft. But one thing that I want, believe me, this book was a lot longer when I finished the first draft. And one of the things I wasn't really able to get into the book was the extent to which Boris was so fixated on understanding and using new media. If you look up in the US Patent Office, Boris Morris actually has a patent for something called the Moropticon. The problem with Boris's name is everything you say makes it sound like he's a moron, but it's called the Moropticon. And it's movie technology that allows you to see in 3D without having to use the glasses, and it's still in use. It's still in use today. He was involved. He had radio shows for about 10 years, and he was just really involved in exploring new media. He also wrote lots of articles. They were almost all ghostwritten. So I think that he was a real chameleon that way, and I think he was able to, in Russia or the United States, or he was able to really move from place to place and from milieu to milieu and from party to party and really be able to fit in wherever he was. He really seems in many cases like kind of very much a creature of our time, such a media creation, someone who really knew how to manipulate that. Just the sheer amount of information that's out there about him that we now have access to is itself a problem.
I think I think we should draw this to a close before too long. There's one question that I'm not sure whether that I think we might as well briefly address, that asks, considering a parallel to the contemporary issue of Julian Assange's activities, what are your thoughts on the connections with a reference to the excessive approach certain politicians have taken toward condemning his mission, Assange's mission? Do we want to address this? Do we have anything to say about this question? Which will be.
I've never really followed Julian Assange's whole situation really carefully, but I will say, maybe Ruth or Natalie want to say a little bit more, but I will say that Boris had this very brilliant, ironic way with secrecy. His idea was to be totally out in the open, to leave his door open, leave all the documents on his desk, because he thought no one will ever suspect someone who doesn't look like he's hiding something. That's why he was driving the Soviets crazy, because he would continue to socialize with Russians in Hollywood when it would just bring up suspicions. And he would say, no one will think I'm a spy because look all the Russians I'm talking to. So Boris had this very interesting way with the secrecy, and he was able to really turn it his own way. And I think that's a different kind of universe than the one in which Julian Assange is working, which you have hidden documents, and that's where the truth is going to be, right? As opposed to the lack of documents which will obfuscate the truth, or documents which are lying. And so that's really all. I mean, much more than that, I don't really have to say. I haven't really followed that carefully.
Well,
perhaps the only thing I'd like to add to that is I think there's a big difference in the principle behind the actions of the actors you're speaking of, Boris Morros versus Assange. I think what Jonathan Gill is saying about the entire Boris Morris's only ideology being money, that's very different for Assange. So I'm not sure you can draw that parallel quite that easily.
All right. On that note, I think I can take my moderator's prerogative and draw this to a close. But first, I do want to applaud this book, not for the and then I will say something that's perhaps different from the author's intention. You know, we've been talking a bit. We've been gravitating back and forth between whether the world of this book is the same as our world or different from our world. And this is, you know, we could debate this for a very long time, which is the broader question of whether we are, what is our relationship to the Cold War? That also we would debate for a very long time. There is a certain melancholy in this book, partly because there is a melancholy at the center of this opportunistic figure, Boris Morris, I think. It's also, there's a hint of, in any book that excavates a lost world of espionage will inevitably be, at least in part, if ironically, nostalgic for that lost world of espionage. There is even a kind of, when you close this book, you feel like there's something lost, and you turn back to our president and somehow feels, has a curious effect of making these times feel more tawdry and oddly less free. That's an ironic effect of this book, perhaps, but one that sticks with me. And so on that note, I want to thank, I suppose I've given myself the last word, but I want to thank our panelists. Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you very much, Ruud, and thank you very much, Jonathan, for sharing this book with us, which I recommend.
And thanks to Fatima as well for organizing.
Thank you, Fatima, for organizing this unruly bunch of panels with unreliable internet connections. Very grateful. Thank you all.
Thank you.